So yeah, a very short overview of climate science and what we are expecting for the future on climate change. So I'm head of climate impacts research at the Met Office Hadley Centre and also professor at the University of Exeter. So we know a lot about weather and climate. We've been monitoring it for years and decades, in fact over a century in some cases. There's all sorts of data coming in from satellites, weather balloons, weather stations, ships, buoys in the oceans and so on. So there's a lot of information on what is happening with the weather day to day and climate long term. And to understand this and to predict it for the future, both for the short term for weather forecasting and the long term for climate change, and for understanding past climate change, we use computer models because we can't do scientific experiments with the Earth because we only have one Earth, but we have a virtual laboratory, if you like, our computer models, which represent the motion of the atmosphere, rainfall, the physics of the atmosphere, the buildup of greenhouse gases and so on, in the form of mathematical equations in computer code run on our giant supercomputers near the Met Office at Exeter. And actually it's the same kind of models that we use for the weather forecast that we use for understanding past and future climate change, and in particular the implications of the buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases of the atmosphere, which are causing the warming of the world and changing rainfall patterns and so on. This field of science has been going for many decades. Computer modeling of climate started in the 60s, and this is a paper from the journal Nature published in 1972 by a Met Office scientist called John Sawyer, who predicted, using the models at the time, were developed by many other scientists, that the increase in CO2 by the end of the 20th century would cause a warming of about 0.6 of a degree Celsius. That was his prediction. And that was quite radical because actually in the previous 20 years, there'd actually been slight cooling. This graph shows that for each year from 1850 to 1972, there's a difference between that year's global average temperature from all these global observations I talked about and the long-term average. So you can see that since the 1950s and 1960s, there's been a slight cooling, even though overall it had been slightly warmer than the 19th century. So the world had been cooling. Sawyer and other climate scientists predicted a warming of about 0.6 of a degree Celsius. And what happened was actually pretty close to that. The world actually warmed by about half a degree Celsius by the year 2000. So their prediction was pretty much spot on. And the world has continued to warm since then. And now we're at about 1 degree Celsius warmer than the 19th century. And this will carry on if we keep putting more greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. So here's two possible scenarios of future global warming. The red bars are if we continue to emit at current rates or higher, we'll see about 4 degrees global warming by the end of the century. But even if we rein in emissions radically now, we're committed to some further warming, and we're probably going to see at least 1.5 degrees global warming compared to the 19th century. So as further changes are in the pipeline, we can limit them, but we can't reverse them on any meaningful timescale. So the question is, what does this mean for UK weather, and in particular for Devon and the Culm Valley? So again, we can use our computer models to drill down on this into finer detail. The most obvious thing is going to be hotter. That's a no-brainer. We'll see more intense heat waves and longer heat waves. The other no-brainer is that in the coast around Devon, we'll see higher sea levels. Sea levels are already rising because of melting ice, putting more water into the oceans, and seawater expands as it warms as well. So events like the famous collapse of the railway embankment at Dawlish a few years ago, there'll be an increased risk of that kind of thing as sea levels continue to rise. But it's more complicated looking at water, and as Nick was saying, water is really crucial for the area that we're considering in this meeting. Will it be wetter or will it be drier? And the answer is a bit more complicated than just one or the other of those. Overall, our climate models project an increase in rainfall in the winter. This is a map of one particular, the average projection of winter rainfall change by the average of the years 2061 to 2080, so the middle of the second half of this century. So in Devon, we're expecting around about about 15 to 30% increase in UK average rainfall in the best guess, if you like, our central estimate. But we can't predict things perfectly. There's a range of possible outcomes. It could be less than 15%, it could be more than 30%, or maybe even over 45% in South Devon, actually. So a range of possibilities, but winter rainfall is expected to go up. Summer rainfall, though, is predicted to go in the opposite direction. Generally, we'll see a drying of the weather across the UK, and in Devon, perhaps around between 20 and 40% decrease in summer rainfall in our central estimate. But again, a range of possible outcomes there. It could be less than that, it could be more, it could be up to a 60% or even more than a 60% reduction in summer rainfall. So summers will be drier overall, wetters will be winter. But it's still more complicated than that, because even though summers are probably going to be drier overall, when it rains, it'll rain harder. A warmer world means more intense rainfall. The land surface drives more intense thunderstorms, for example. So although summers overall are predicted to be drier on average, when it does rain, the rainfall will be more intense, and perhaps a sort of a 30% increase in intensity of rainfall on wet days. So just to wrap up then, we are warming the world. Climate change is happening, it is our fault. This will continue to some extent, although it's up to us as a global society as to how much this will happen, and we can reduce the worst by reining in emissions. However, some further change is already in the pipeline. In the UK and in Devon and in the Culm, we're going to expect warmer, wetter winters, hotter summers, probably drier overall, but when it does rain, it'll rain more intensely. And that's it. Thank you.